I will make no opinions of my own in this video, and this is purely a history video, nothing more.
Zoomer historian is a British pseudo-historian. That means he presents himself as a historian, presents his content as history, but utilizes different methodology and evidence than that used by trained historians. It's similar to pseudoscience. Scientists may assert that the Earth is round based on commonly held evidence, while a pseudoscientific approach may find the world to be flat based on bunk evidence. He presents his channel as, quote, apolitical, but like most YouTube essayists, he's very clearly arguing for certain political positions in his videos, and his content can be considered part of a larger political movement or project. With most video essayists, this ranges from things such as arguing for better public transit or wanting a return to the gold standard for some reason. Zoomer historian's political project and larger political movement is Nazism. Many have quote-unquote exposed Zoomer historian's Nazism in long-form videos before. There's really not much need for that. He doesn't exactly hide it, and Hope Not Hate UK showed his clear links to Nazi organizations. Hope Not Hate also posted his real identity, though I don't know the means by which they acquired this, and I don't know the rules regarding stuff like this on YouTube, so I'll replace the picture of him with a picture of Tintin, to whom he bears a striking resemblance. Instead of talking about Zoomer historian the person, I want to talk about how piss-poor of a so-called historian this person is. Zoomer historian presents himself as neutral in that he is simply, quote, stating the facts. This is an incredibly common way to frame very loaded history content on YouTube. When framing something as history, it imparts a degree of authority and authenticity to the content. In my previous video, I talked about how even framing video games as history gives them a degree of believability that helps audiences resonate with the game. What Zoomer historian is doing is exploiting this to manipulate you into believing there is no slant, angle, or anything to what's being presented, that he's only presenting the, quote, facts. This should be obvious to most, but his pro-Hitler content isn't aimed at capturing the attention of the brightest people. He's of course looking for people who are susceptible to Nazi propaganda. He's picking specific facts which, when viewed separately from the rest, may be entirely truthful on their own. Then he arranges it into a misleading narrative that conspicuously misses a whole host of other very important facts. Many watching this may not be that versed in historiography, that being the study of history itself as a field, not of specific historical topics. The term historiography is also used about specific historical fields to refer to the past work in said field. Most historians discussing a topic will usually begin by referring to past work and how their new work fits into the wider historiography. When Zoomer historian does this, he goes down the tried and true conspiracy theorist route of telling you that you've been lied to, that all you thought you knew was false, and finally, this former FIFA YouTuber has come to serve you the cold hard truth.
According to the historical narrative, one of the most egregious myths of the Third Reich. At first glance, the Second World War, or at least the narrative of it that is formed after the fact, makes it seem as if Adolf Hitler was a crazed warmonger who wanted to conquer, if not the world, then at least Europe. This is what people say, at least. This narrative, however, is hard to square with the fact that it was actually Adolf Hitler and the Germans, not the British or the Americans, who were the ones desperately seeking peace. This video is purely a work of history, and in no way, shape, or form political. I will try to avoid giving my own opinion on matters in this video, and will simply state what happened. However you want to interpret events is entirely up to you.
The reason I bring up historiography is because it, among other things, teaches historians about the many limitations of their craft. History is generally and traditionally presented in written narrative form. When you read or watch anything, that thing is carefully constructed by its author to impart certain ideas. The historian attempts to truthfully represent history as they understand it, but it is still a historian's interpretation. And to complicate things further, this historian is basing themselves on written sources, which themselves may contain interpretation, which the historian must account for. And, after all this work has been diligently done, an audience or future historian will then further interpret this work. There's no possible way to present pure objective facts without opinion or analysis in history. At every step of the way, you as a historian must decide which sources are more relevant, which aspects of the sources are more relevant, and what methods to utilize, and so on. The history you produce is a product of you and the sources. Quoting Edward Hallett Carr from his influential work, What is History? The historian is neither the humble slave nor the tyrannical master of its facts. The relation between the historian and his facts is one of equality, of give and take. As any working historian knows, if he stops to reflect what he's doing as he thinks and writes, the historian is engaged on a continuous process of molding his facts to his interpretation, and his interpretation to his facts. It is impossible to assign primacy to one over the other. The facts of history cannot be purely objective, since they become facts of history only in virtue of the significance attached to them by the historian. Objectivity in history, if we are still to use that conventional term, cannot be objectivity of fact, but only of relation, of the relation between fact and interpretation, between past, present, and future. Essentially, objectivity in history is not a set of objective facts, but a qualitative assessment of a historian's work in interpreting facts. The objective historian is the diligent historian, the truthful historian, the transparent historian. The objective historian doesn't pretend like they have no opinions. They're consciously aware of them and make no effort to disguise them. Dishonestly pretending like you have no opinions can fool some into believing that, and at that point you are already tarnishing your work of history because the relationship between the interpretation and the facts has become muddied. The Zoomer historian knows he's sometimes lying or bending the truth. He frames his content this way because he's trying to appeal to those not versed enough in history to recognize what he's doing. He's trying to snap up people who either agree with him already or who are gullible enough to believe that a guy who has made his entire channel about reinterpreting Hitler has no agenda or politics. He's trying to appeal to the lowest common denominator, probably children. There is, however, a secondary and perhaps more interesting way to interpret Zoomer historian's rationale for adopting this method of framing his content. When Zoomer historian presents, quote, just facts, he absolves himself of responsibility to relate his content to the wider historiography. He's just telling you things that happened, but it's up to you to make sense of it. To a layman, this might seem like a reasonable thing, but he's skipping past all the work done by trained expert historians to make sense of all these facts, absolving himself of the responsibility and placing all of that responsibility squarely on you. The Zoomer historian is profoundly lazy. By uncritically noting what Hitler said and did, he doesn't have to learn more about the context or about opposing views, and he doesn't have to present these things to you. It works well for his propaganda effort, and it lets him shit out videos at a much more rapid pace than one would be able to do if they did some serious reading. He pretends like he's presenting novel nuance when in reality he is presenting an extremely simplified and dumbed down narrative for easy consumption. When he bemoans the education system for not teaching you this, he's lying in a very clever way. You see, the education system may not have actually told you this specific fact that he's telling you, so in a sense it may seem as if he's telling the truth here. They, quote, kept this from you. But if you think about the journey the knowledge made from the primary source to the classroom, you start to realize why they maybe didn't focus on Hitler's peace offers. An 8-year-old is not expected to do independent analysis of the historiography. That's silly. That's left to the expert historians who conducted primary source research. Those expert historians constructed a narrative that's representative of what they found in the sources, and what they believe to be most truthful. In this narrative, they found that Adolf Hitler's peace offers aren't actually that important, considering the fact that Adolf Hitler started the fucking war to begin with. You see how he weaponizes laziness? He presents these facts independently of the historiography. The focus of this video is on how he's a poor historian. He's obviously doing this tactically as a part of his Nazi propaganda, but we don't have to focus on that or even recognize the Nazism to recognize how bad he is at history. As an example, let's look at the most important aspect of the historian's craft, the sources. The Hitler's Peace Office video does have a bibliography, so let's take a quick look at it. First, Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan is not a historian, and the book referenced here cites no primary sources. Pat Buchanan is an American paleoconservative with an illustrious career of advising Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and defending Nazi war criminals, and also doing a little bit of Holocaust denial. The sources for this are paywalled by the Washington Post, but I'll cite them anyhow on the off chance you have a means to bypass the paywall. Though I would not recommend subscribing to the Washington Post, as it's made its official editorial position to stifle any critiques of billionaires or American oligarchy very clear. Pat Buchanan is a political actor first and foremost. His book is political agitation, not a work of history. Next up is Richard Tidor. Those of you who are paying attention and familiar with World War II historiography will note that I just skipped an author. I am saving the best/worst for last. Richard Tidor seems relatively unknown. I couldn't find much about the author at all. Usually if they're a trained historian at a university, a simple Google search should reveal some information, and I couldn't find any reviews by historians either. The book is up on archive.org, having been added there the same year it was released. From what I understand, this is uncommon for books with publishers who reserve rights to the material. So I checked the Amazon listing, which lists Richard Tidor himself as the publisher. The book is self-published, possibly because Tidor couldn't land a publishing deal because of the content of the book. The book unsurprisingly takes a sometimes ambivalent and sometimes positive view of Nazism. It adopts a largely outdated Sonderweg thesis that sees Germany as having been on a special path of political development that led it to Nazism. Quote, in Germany, the Enlightened Age evolved differently. The Germans' contemplative, methodical approach led to a gradual integration of liberal values with elements of the old order. You can't see it, but I'm making a jerk-off motion in the air with my hand right now. The book makes no mention of the Holocaust. When discussing the oppression of Jews, it mentions how they were mistreated in Poland in the 1920s. The next and perhaps most important part of this bibliography is, quote, What the World Rejected, Hitler's Peace Offers 1933 to 1940. That's pretty much the title of his video. Now you might be wondering why the cutoff is at 1940 when the war lasted until 1945. Did Hitler supposedly abandon the idea of making peace even as he very decidedly was losing the war? No, it's because the author was lacking data for the 5 ensuing years, because the book was published in Nazi Germany in 1940 by the head of cultural policy of the Nazi Foreign Office, hardly an unbiased source. Zoomer historians' lack of precise citation of this source is of course also plagiarism. When relying on somebody else's work, you should always credit them and not leave ambiguity as to what work was done by you, and what work was done by the author you're basing your content on. It's fine to slip up and mess up sometimes, I do it all the time, but it's not fine to consistently avoid doing citations. Finally, this video references two books by David Irving. David Irving entered into the popular consciousness when he sued American historian Deborah Lipstadt for libel because she accused him of Holocaust denial. Here's an excerpt from the UK High Court's ruling on the libel case. Quote, "It appears to me to be incontrovertible that Irving qualifies as a Holocaust denier. Not only has he denied the existence of gas chambers at Auschwitz, Irving is anti-Semitic. The content of his speeches and interviews often displays a distinctly pro-Nazi and anti-Jewish bias. The charges which I have found to be substantially true include the charges that Irving has for his own ideological reasons persistently and deliberately misrepresented and manipulated historical evidence, that for the same reasons he has portrayed Hitler in an unwarrantedly favorable light." Quoting David Lawrence of Hope Not Hate. The content of Zoomer Historian's videos is unsurprising given that he has cited David Irving, the disgraced historian and Holocaust denier, as his main influence, describing him as a hero and his books as masterpieces. Irving Books even offered Zoomer Historian a discount to share with his followers, and was described by Zoomer Historian as, quote, one of his two favorite publishers, alongside the white nationalist Antelope Hill. I'm not even intending to moralize here. The point isn't to paint Zoomer Historian as a Nazi, it's quite obvious he is. The point is to show that he specifically selects for disgraced historians who have been found to have lied, distorted, or manipulated evidence and sources. Some YouTube historians make mistakes in this regard and unknowingly use sources by dishonest historians, and for some it's a conscious part of their methodology. Next, I want to move on to a more pointed critique of his video on Dresden.
But when it comes to the Allied terror bombing campaigns of the Second World War, things are different.
A more apt term is strategic bombing. Terror bombing refers exclusively to targets of little to no perceived military value, and we'll get more into this later on.
Reading accounts of the people on the ground during the genocide is physically hard to read. I had to stop several times, and it literally made me feel ill.
What's about to follow is Zoomer Historian's clumsy attempt at building the case for genocidal intent demonstrated by all Allied parties, relying mostly on Nazi wartime propaganda as his source. The charge of genocide, as outlined in the Genocide Convention of 1948, requires intent. We will assess how well Zoomer Historian manages to demonstrate genocidal intent on the part of the Allies towards the end of this section.
The events are totally glossed over, because as we know, the victors write the narrative.
This is the real world, not Call of Duty.
In fact, here in Britain, our bombing campaigns were never mentioned in history class.
I have lots of UK friends whom I speak to, and I ask them about this. From 4 friends from different parts of the UK, I got wildly different answers. 2 believed it was covered, but their memory of it is hazy. They talked about how different their respective schools' approach to history class was. I didn't specifically ask them about Dresden, only about Allied bombing campaigns, and one of my friends told me she had read about Dresden in one of those horrible histories pop history books as a kid. All of this is anecdotal and is as worthless evidence as Zoomer historians claim, but the point I wanted to make is that I believe it's most likely that Allied bombing of Germany was covered in history class, that it was likely covered differently in various councils, and that even so it probably just wasn't covered to the level of detail, or in the way Zoomer historian would have preferred.
Let's discuss what actually happened, and why it was a uniquely evil and criminal event, the likes of which the world had never seen before.
Bear in mind that this sort of firebombing was perpetrated against Tokyo as well, with far worse consequences. Atomic bombs are also dropped on Japan. Germany embarked on a campaign of expulsion and extermination through forced labor and starvation against the peoples to their east. The firebombing of Dresden, while terrifying and horrific, was no unique evil in this conflict. And bear in mind, that's just me talking about things done in pursuit of ostensibly military objectives. Far worse systematic atrocities were perpetrated against civilian populations in China, Korea, the Philippines, and against minorities across Europe in this period, including but not limited to the European Jewish population.
In his popular 1941 book, Germany Must Perish, author Theodor Kaufmann wrote, "This time, Germany has forced a total war upon the world. Germany must perish forever. In fact, not in fancy. The goal of world domination must be removed from the reach of the German, and the only way to accomplish this is to remove the German from the world."
At this point, you will probably not at all be surprised to find that Zoomer Historian is leaving quite a bit out of the story. Zoomer Historian asserts Kaufmann's so-called book was, quote, popular. He cleverly leaves out the fact that, for one, it was a pamphlet, not a book, and that it was only popular in a single country. That country being Nazi Germany. Kaufmann wrote in America, but his crackpot idea, to my understanding, garnered little attention in the English-speaking world, but was incredibly well received by Germany's Ministry of Propaganda. Quoting Richard Evans in The Third Reich at War, Kaufman was an eccentric, to put it no more strongly than that, who had already earned the ridicule of the press in the USA by urging the sterilization of all American men to stop their children becoming murderers and criminals. Nevertheless, Goebbels seized upon this new pamphlet, portrayed Kaufman as an official advisor to the White House, and trumpeted it as a Jewish product that revealed the true intentions of the Roosevelt government towards Germany. Goebbels made sure to have the pamphlet translated and distributed along the front line. I think it's reasonably safe to conclude that Kaufman's largest, if not most enthusiastic reader base were not anti-German Brits or Americans, but anti-Semitic Germans.
More influentially, back in the US, Henry Morgenthau called for 2/3 of the German population to be killed by starvation and thousands more shot out of hand.
He's referring to the Morgenthau Plan, which was proposed in 1944. The document is not classified or secret in any way, shape, or form and can be read by anyone. The plan was not intended to starve the German population to death, and no parts of the plan called for the shooting of Germans. This is nonsense. The plan was not implemented because it was believed it would result in many deaths to starvation as Germany was forcefully deindustrialized. And it should also be remembered that while this plan was never implemented, instead, the opposite happened, with Germany being rebuilt through the Marshall Plan.
One of the most influential writers in the Soviet Union, and perhaps the entire world, targeted his propaganda at the average Red Army soldier. He said, "The Germans are not human beings. If you have not killed at least one German a day, you have wasted that day. If you cannot kill your German with a bullet, kill him with your bayonet."
The quote keeps going on about killing Germans. He loves to claim these people as tremendously influential without citation. I don't know if Ehrenberg was one of the most influential writers in the entire world, but I think it's safe to say he was influential in the Soviet Union. An important bit of context here is that these writings were published in the Red Army's newspaper after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. This was wartime propaganda aimed at galvanizing the Red Army against an invading army. It is absolutely dehumanizing, but no more than the propaganda issued by Nazi Germany in support of its aggression against the Soviet Union. In 1943, Ehrenberg remarked that this war was, quote, different from all preceding wars. Germany is pursuing two insane goals: the annihilation of the peoples and the annihilation of the human principle. History has not seen any comparable attack on the very essence of mankind. Ehrenberg's deep hatred was partly informed by his reading of the letters and diaries of German soldiers, many of which were then published in order to mobilize the Soviet peoples against the enemy. He believed most German soldiers were primitive creatures boasting of their superiority while really being, quote, profoundly ignorant, blindly repeating all the Nazi claptrap. Thousands of diaries, notebooks, and letters have revealed to us the simple world of these people. But there was another kind, quote, Hitlerites who are indifferent to chicken and boots as trophies, and are ruthless toward others and themselves, whose eyes are aflame with intense fanaticism. These are the essence and meaning of fascism and its so-called philosophy. Ehrenberg concluded Nazism to breed, quote, heartless formal submission to the sovereignty of death. This is why Nazi soldiers are so cruel and sullen. The cruelty of the Nazi soldier, as opposed to the ordinary Nazi's cruelty, is not an act of debauchery or an excess on the part of a drunken gang, but a constitutional part of the fascist Weltanschauung. The cult of death demands bloody and frequently refined tortures. The pamphlet Zoomer historian is quoting was written during the Battle of Stalingrad, and should be viewed in the context of this, not as a call for the murder of Germans cried out in a complete vacuum. Bear in mind that none of this is a so-called objective depiction of every German soldier's character. This only depicts how their character was experienced by Ilya Ehrenberg and the civilians and the Red Army soldiers he corresponded with. It's a source for understanding their feelings towards the German invaders. The Germans acknowledged the existence of Ilya Ehrenberg, and as the Red Army approached German territory, their writings on him became more alarmed. Quote, Ilya Ehrenberg is urging the Asiatic people to drink the blood of German women. This is dated to December 1944. A month later, as Ehrenberg was accompanying the Red Army into German territory, he publicly criticized indiscriminate violence visited upon the German civilian populace, saying it was unbefitting of Soviet cultural standards. Quote, he was reprimanded by Stalin for besmirching the heroic Red Army. To nobody's surprise, Ilya Ehrenberg is a more interesting and complicated character than Zoomer historian depicts him as. At this point, I want to levy another charge against Zoomer historian. His tendentious, deceitful, and simplistic approach to history not only misrepresents history, it also makes history less interesting. It makes history boring.
The message was heard loud and clear by the average soldier, and many obeyed to the word. The events that fell upon the German people on the Eastern Front are uniquely horrifying in their own regard.
While being careful not to minimize the suffering of civilians in wartime, if that is at all what he's getting at, it's obviously absurd to consider what befell Germans on the Eastern Front as uniquely horrifying or evil. Similar evils had been visited upon the peoples of the Soviet Union as an intentional consequence of the German invasion. The conduct of the Wehrmacht and the SS in Eastern Europe undoubtedly contributed to the dehumanization of Germans that occurred in the psyche of many Red Army soldiers. The German military set the stakes of the conflict, set the terms by which it would be waged, and by the end of it, their own civilian populace paid a horrible price for this escalation of violence.
By 1945, the bombing of German cities was nothing new. Winston Churchill had initiated this early in the war by beginning the indiscriminate bombing of population centres. After holding his nerve and not wanting to take part in this horrible game, eventually Hitler replied in kind, and the back and forth bombing of cities began.
Here it's important to note that the first bombing of a major civilian population center in the war was not carried out against the Germans, but carried out by the Germans against Warsaw. After the artillery and bombing had done its job, about 12% of the city was destroyed or seriously damaged. Quoting Frederick Taylor's Dresden, on September 24th, 1,000 German planes devastated the city. The next day, 420. By the end of the second day, 10,000 civilians lay dead within Fortress Warsaw. Then, on the 10th of May, 1940, the Germans began bombing major cities in the Low Countries and in France. Quoting historian Richard Overy, like the bombing of Warsaw, the operations against Rotterdam imposed heavy civilian casualties because the Dutch army chose to defend the area rather than declare it an open city or surrender. Quoting further, Paris might have suffered something of the same fate as Rotterdam if the French army and government had insisted on defending the French capital to the last. A number of military targets were bombed around Paris on the 3rd of June, in the later stages of the campaign in the west, but on the 11th of June it was declared an open city by the French commander-in-chief Maxime Weygand, and evacuated by the government and military high command. When Zoomer historian talks about the British initiating indiscriminate bombing of civilian population centers while Hitler was reluctant to do so, he is obviously lying. Quoting Taylor's Dresden, smarting from the humiliation of a tiny RAF raid on Berlin, and, it is said, hoping to lure the stubbornly resisting Spitfires and Hurricanes into the air in defense of their own capital, the Nazi leadership ordered its forces to attack targets in the heart of London. The spectacular results of the air raids on British cities in terms of damage and casualties may have bolstered morale in Germany, temporarily alarmed the Reich's enemies, and impressed neutral onlookers, but in direct military terms they achieved little except to infuriate the British people and provoke calls for revenge attacks by the RAF. The British attempted to seek their revenge in August to little real effect, but in so doing granted German propaganda a massive boon. Quoting Goebbels, "Now Berlin is also right in the middle of the war, and that is a good thing." Quoting Taylor again, so feeble was the British efforts against German soil in the autumn of 1940 that Goebbels had to resort to faking British atrocities to rouse the German public. Germany, through its aggression in Poland, the Low Countries, and France, was setting terms under which cities either emerged unscathed or suffered the destructive effects of artillery and bombs, in this era of increasingly sophisticated air power. The answer was a city that surrenders emerges unscathed. A city that's defended gets bombed. This was completely in accordance with the laws of war as laid down in the Hague Convention of 1907. Frederick Taylor reasons that the law, laid down just 4 years after the Wright brothers' first flight, could not have begun to imagine the devastation an air force could visit upon a city just a few decades later. On November 14, 1940, 510 German bombers departed for Coventry, a city of 320,000 inhabitants but possessing some manner of industry nestled inside its urban center. According to Frederick Taylor, the bombers came armed with conventional high-explosive bombs, air mines, and masses of incendiary bombs. Quote, "There was no mistaking the intention of the Luftwaffe on this moonlit November night. Its plan was to set Coventry ablaze. This all will become very important when assessing the case of Dresden. Why does Frederick Taylor's book about Dresden, which amounts to over 500 pages, contain over 100 pages about Germany bombing Poland, France, Britain, and so on? It's because the bombing of Dresden didn't happen in a vacuum. All of this forms important context to the bombing. This is how historians write. This is all stuff Zoomer historian would never tell his audience, at least not in any meaningful detail."
By 1945, more bombs had fallen on Berlin alone than the Germans had dropped on all of England combined.
This is a funny bit of rhetoric that doesn't really mean much when you take into account the fact that Germany only seriously carried out a bombing campaign against Britain for about 10 or 11 months. Heavy German bombing of British cities had stopped in early June 1941. That same year, Britain began raids against German cities in an effort to take some of the heat off the Soviet Union by forcing Germany to divert fighters to the west. Then, of course, the Americans joined the war with their immense industrial output. The comparison isn't very productive. Germany's early war bombing effort against England, lasting scarcely a year while possessing no heavy bombers whatsoever, compared to the industrial output of the entirety of the Allies with their scores of heavy bombers, a battered defending German air force, and several years of bombing. Yes, Berlin was bombed severely.
A prime example being Hamburg, which was burnt to a crisp by firebombs for over a week straight, resulting in up to 100,000 civilian deaths, and that's just US figures. The lower range is around 40,000 by British sources.
I'm not sure what US numbers he's looking at here, but I think he's referencing Operation Gomorrah, which was the incendiary bombing of Hamburg in 1943, which, quote, was the single largest loss of civilian life in one city throughout the whole European war. exceeded only by the 250,000 Japanese killed in the firebombing of Tokyo and the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Quote, the cumulative total for Operation Gomorrah calculated by the local police authorities by December 1943 was 31,647. The figure was revised in May 1944 to 38,975, which is close to the figure currently favored of 37,000. That is to say, it is currently believed 37,000 people were killed in the incendiary bombing campaign against Hamburg, not over 100,000.
A quote by Thomas Goodrich from the book Hellstorm sums up the scenes rather well. Due to the tremendous heat, some bunkers contained only dozens of log-like shapes, charred and shriveled to only a quarter of their original size.
The book and the movie of the same name that Thomas Goodrich co-wrote with its director neo-Nazi Kyle Hunt is not an authoritative work of history. It's a polemic that seeks to expose Allied, quote, war crimes. The quoted section is from page 34 of Hellstorm, but carries footnotes to Middlebrook's Hamburg and Hastings' Bomber Command. Though it doesn't actually concern Hamburg at all, which is what Zoomer Historian was talking about at this point, it's about the bombing of Darmstadt. Either Zoomer Historian made a mistake while plumbing the book for grueling quotes, which is possible because the author of Hellstorm speaks about Hamburg on previous pages, or Zoomer Historian is borrowing a horrible account from a separate event to make another event to look more terrifying. Also, Hellstorm cites page 266 of Martin Middlebrook's The Battle of Hamburg for this chilling section, but I can't see any relevance to it on page 266 of the book, and in fact the surrounding pages talk about a very ineffective firebombing raid on Hamburg that caused little damage. There exists a possibility that I and the author of Hellstorm are looking at separate editions of the book, though the release year of my copy and the copy listed in Hellstorm's bibliography is identical, so this shouldn't be the case. So significant portions of this quote that Zoomer Historian reads seems to have no connection to any source. Though again, I am leaving open the possibility that these are separate editions of the book.
Surely, even these terror bombers had the heart not to bomb a barely defended and militarily unimportant cultural centre hundreds of miles from their own front lines, or so the residents of this doomed city thought. The town had barely any industry to mention.
Quoting the 1942 Dresden yearbook, anyone who knows Dresden only as a cultural city would rightly be very surprised to be made aware of the extensive and versatile industrial activity, with all its varied ramifications, that make Dresden one of the foremost industrial locations of the Reich.
Fasching is a German event, kind of like Mardi Gras. It fell on the 13th of February. In all of Germany, celebrations did not go ahead like normal due to the war, except in one city. Dresden was still in a fit enough state for celebrations to go ahead.
Technically true, but technically not. Quote, the city's people, and especially its children, have spent the day celebrating a somewhat toned-down wartime version of Fasching.
At 10 p.m, however, the sirens sounded.
It was 9:51 p.m, but close enough, I guess.
Klaus von Ferentiel, an SS officer, laying injured in a military hospital, missing half his hip at the time, recalls how he felt it simply couldn't be true. Surely, these fellow Christians, these supposedly civilized men of Western civilization, couldn't commit such an obvious war crime. Tons and tons of bombs began hurtling down to Earth.
You're talking about an SS officer bemoaning the war crimes of the Allies, dude. Come on.
The circus performers for the Fasching festival and their animals were ripped from the face of the earth.
Beyond his consistent lying, I have no cause to doubt that most of the devastation Zoomer Historian describes is somewhat representative. However, this part just is not true. Quote, the circus air raid warden could nevertheless proudly report that no one who stayed in the circus building had died as a result of enemy action. Of the staff who perished, all were either with the doomed animals on the bank of the Elbe during the second attack, or had set off for home after the first raid. They died at home or were killed in the streets, like so many other Dresdeners. The account reproduced in Taylor's book only mentions the tigers perishing in the fire, no other animals, though it does mention that some horses were wounded. Circus staff did die, but not from bombs hitting the circus. They died because they were in Dresden.
The city had no anti-aircraft defences to speak of.
This is often brought up, and I'm not quite sure why, because Dresden being undefended wasn't because of its lack of military importance. In fact, it was heavily defended in the past. It was barely defended because Germany, having been fighting a losing war for arguably around 2 years at this point, no longer had the means to defend itself adequately. On October 7, 1944, less than a year before the Dresden firebombing, the Allies carried out bomber raids against oil processing plants in central and eastern Germany. Weather complicated the bombing raid, causing many bombers to not find their targets. Under such circumstances, mission come with secondary targets. For the 303rd Group of B-17 bombers, this meant they would either proceed towards Dresden or Zwickau. Its commander chose Dresden, with the rail yards as their target. They were greeted by, quote, moderate to intensive and accurate flak. Flak is a colloquial term for anti-aircraft artillery. That is, military defenses against aircraft. In other words, Dresden was very much a defended city. Of the 30 B-17s in this flight, 10 suffered substantial damage from anti-aircraft fire. That is 1/3 substantially damaged, hardly undefended. Over time, however, the flak in Dresden was depleted or had been withdrawn to defend other targets. The city was supposedly defended by 20mm light anti-air, but this hardly amounted to much. But Allied planners could not have known that this would be the case by February 1945. Neither could they have known that the Luftwaffe would send up no fighters. It wasn't until the first Mosquito heavy fighter went down to 2,000 or 3,000 feet to drop flares to mark the aiming point that pilots became aware of what they apparently had suspected for some time, that Dresden was undefended by anti-aircraft artillery. Dresden should have been defended. It was a city of strategic importance due to its industry and the presence of the rail junction. But because of the dwindling resources of the Reich at this point in the war, it was not adequately defended.
And the planes were flying so low that they could see the masses of costumed partygoers in the streets.
This one is absurd for a number of reasons. The bombing took place after 10 p.m. in February. On the 13th of February, the sun sets around 7 p.m. in Dresden, with twilight occurring somewhere between 5 to 6 p.m. depending on your definition of twilight. This is all according to timeanddate.com. As I've already mentioned, the bombers needed advanced aircraft to drop flares to mark their aiming points, and we have recordings of the bomber crews searching for the flares. In terms of bombing altitude, 49th Squadron, described as going in relatively low due to the absence of flak, was bombing at an altitude somewhere between 12,000 feet and 13,500 feet. I want you to imagine what you'd be able to see at an altitude of 12,000 feet at 10 p.m. at night. Now, knowing that Zoomer Historian had brought up Hellstorm, I decided to look into it. I found the passage that I believe he read for this section, but I can't be sure since it doesn't do citations. It's on page 107. This is also seemingly where he got his anecdote about everyone in the circus being blown to bits, which didn't happen, and Hellstorm cites nothing for this particular claim. It also claims the night was, quote, bright as day, but I have no idea how or why that would be, prior to the firebombing at least. I have not seen any source describe the moon as particularly bright or the skies as cloudless. I tried to find a reason for why the night could have been, quote, bright as day, but could not find one. However, as I said earlier, the night could have been bright as day after the bombing. The first instance of that turn of phrase in the book is used by an eyewitness account to describe the scene after the city was set ablaze, and later to describe the brightness of a marking flare that landed close to someone's house. The author of Hellstorm thereafter transforms the meaning of it to apply to general visibility conditions for the bombers. After about 3 minutes of describing the horrors, focusing quite a bit on zoo animals, he gets to the second wave of bombers.
The terrified voice of the announcer blared out over the few radios that still functioned, telling everyone to get to shelter, and that another wave of bombers was coming. Over 1,000 Allied bombers came flying overhead, low enough to see the masses of dead.
In total, more than 1,000 bombers would hit Dresden, but the second wave consisted of, quote, more than 550 British bombers, though only 525 aircraft arrived at the target. He once again says they bombed low enough to see the dead, which once again is doubtful, considering this wave bombed from even higher than the first at 20,000 feet, and into the smoke billowing from the fires of the first raid. Though I should note that Mackey, which is an older source and possibly not an expert one, claims that one bomber went below clouds at 8,000 feet. Whether or not he could have seen anything at that altitude I can't say, but many years later he claims he did. Though I should note that being able to distinguish individuals but not the aiming point marked by illuminating flares, which according to eyewitnesses burned bright as day, seems strange. Though there may be factors at play here which I could not find in the sources. Quote, despite illuminating flares, the smoke from the fires rendered it impossible to identify the aiming point with certainty.
Over 1,000 bombers dropped not only the usual payload of bombs, but thousands of incendiary bombs. These bombs were timed to land and fall amongst the debris into every nook and cranny. They had deliberately flattened the city hours earlier so that they could now drop these incendiaries to cause the maximum amount of death. The city went up like a tinderbox.
Zoomer Historian gets confused about what happened and claims the first bombers dropped high explosives to turn the city into rubble, and the second wave dropped incendiaries on the rubble. This is not what happened. Both dropped a mix of high explosives and incendiaries. In fact, the first attack was so effective at lighting the city on fire, it provided two challenges to the second wave. One, the smoke clouds were far more intense than any cloud cover would be that night, and two, the target was already in flames. So the bombers had to quickly make a decision to have their marker planes mark new targets, so as to not just drop bombs onto the exact same spots, effectively wasting the entire attack. This meant the attack was less concentrated and less coordinated. It also led to Dresden becoming the greatest area destroyed in a single night. Quote, it was squadron leader De Wesselo and wing commander Legoud's joint decision, as the second wave surged towards Dresden, to abandon the designated aiming point and bomb outside the already burning areas of the city, which turned the raid into a byword for slaughter. Their move doomed not only large areas of the residential suburbs, but also the great gathering places of the homeless and the dehoused. Taylor here explicitly says that this decision turned the bombing from any other into something perceived as far more brutal. Let me read a very important section of Taylor's Dresden to you. It now seemed that the British were bombing the dispossessed and the homeless. The park, the zoo, the lodges, exhibition buildings, and restaurants were all sacrificed to explosion and flame. This was starting to look like sadism, and that would be the view of many observers after the war. To the aircrew, most of whose knowledge of the cityscape of Dresden and its amenities was at best cursory, the evidence is that it just looked like an area that needed to be bombed. There was no special sadism at work here or deliberate plan to maximize human suffering. The bombers were of course aware of the human cost this raid would have, this was war, but they did not have intimate knowledge of circumstances on the ground, and did not take measures intended to maximize suffering, as Zoomer historian implies. In fact, when A for Able came in for its bomb run, instructions as to where to bomb ceased, presumably because of the discussion of the ad hoc plan between the planes in charge of the bomb run. So the bombardier for A for Able made a decision, assuming wrongly that the lead bomber had been killed. Quote, I told Dig to turn to starboard to the south of the city. He swung the aircraft away from the heart of the inferno, and when we were just beyond the fringe of the fires, I pressed the bomb release. I hoped the load would fall into open country. I couldn't forget what we had been told at briefing, or the old newsreels of German dive-bombing atrocities. Another tail gunner, part of a rookie crew on their first mission, said, So this is trial under fire. We did it. We have almost completed our first trip. There is no jubilation from the crew, not even a slight hurrah.
Allied pilots after the war spoke of how they could literally see women, children, dogs, and all sorts moving below on the streets as they dropped their bombs on them, and how terrible they felt afterwards. However bad they felt, it changed nothing.
It's at this point, when Zoomer historian is plagiarizing Hellstrom once again, that I could find his source for Allied pilots being able to see people down below. It cites McKee again. It's a passage on page 183. It's the Wesselow's own recollection of events. He's unsure of some of the details, like the position of the industrial areas in relation to where he was at the time, or the position of the actual smoke cloud from the city. He does recall seeing people in the street. He said, quote, All these raids were pretty horrifying though.
The local parks were a scene of total death and destruction. The RAF knew that the civilians would flee to these open spaces to escape the flames, so they hit the parks particularly hard to kill as many people as they could.
As I've explained, this wasn't the case. We know what the plans were for Dresden. We also know that the bombs of the second wave fell where they did due to an ad hoc decision made purely on the basis of dropping bombs in other location than where they had already fallen. These bombs were dropped outside of where they were originally planned to drop. This park had no military value. It was not on the list of targets. Zoomer historian's claim is that this was deliberately planned for. It wasn't. And to imagine that the pilots had a one-to-one understanding of what was going on the ground in order to make this decision to bomb the specific area civilians were gathering is absurd, especially considering the confusion I've already detailed which caused one bomber to jettison its bombs towards open country. Surely, if the plan was to maximize civilian casualties, he could have just dropped them randomly over the city instead.
The survivors began to assemble in whatever open spaces still remained. Individuals became a mass as they all trudged along towards the bombed out main park, each person injured in their own unique way, but just relieved to be alive. The relief didn't last long. The air raid sirens blared again, and a mass of US fighters came swarming from the sky, opening fire at the masses of refugees, tearing them to pieces. They hit them in the parks, they hit them in the columns fleeing the city, they hit them everywhere they could find them. One even deliberately targeting the last living giraffe, as well as others like deers and other animals at the zoo.
This is my favorite part of Zoomer Historian's video because among all the insane stuff he says, this is the most deranged. Especially the part about a fighter plane deliberately trying to kill a giraffe. This never happened. McKee's book seems to uncritically repeat eyewitness accounts claiming this, and so does Hellstorm for obvious reasons. This is why I earlier in the video said McKee's book may not be an expert source, and pointed out that it's quite old by this point. Over 40 years old. Frederick Taylor addresses this myth in Appendix A of his book. Taylor has traced the myth to a post-war German report from 1952 by a writer named Axel Rodenberger, published in a pop magazine called Das Grüne Blatt. I probably messed up that pronunciation. However, what really brought the myth to the fore was the international bestseller The Destruction of Dresden in 1963, by none other than the man proven by a UK High Court to have deliberately misrepresented and manipulated historical evidence, the Holocaust denier David Irving. Now, I want to apologize ahead of time because I want to devote significant time just to this strafing myth because it's very funny how wrong Zoomer historian and David Irving are. As funny as discussing lies about a grim event such as this can be anyhow. I'm going to put up a ticking counter showing how many times the base assumptions of this myth are contradicted by simple documented facts. First, Irving embellished an already existing mythical tale by the first communist prime minister of Saxony, published in a book that was, quote, half a serious attempt at history, half an anti-Western rant. Irving alleged, among other things, that a choir boy was killed by strafing. This choir boy was killed by British bombs in the second British night raid, which we've discussed. This was before a single P-51 had taken to the air. He cites a police chief who was reporting what he was told, which we know to be erroneous, as the police chief says strafing was observed on every raid, including the British raid, which Frederick Taylor says was, quote, an impossibility given the circumstances. David Irving claims the American strafing attacks were carried out by the 20th Fighter Group. Quote, he goes on to recount how simultaneously with the end of the American attack at 12:23 p.m., the 37 P-51s of the 20th Fighter Group's A Group hurtled low towards the city. The 20th Fighter Group was engaged in an American raid against the city that ended at 12:23 p.m., a raid against Prague, 80 miles away from Dresden. The Dresden raid ended at 12:31 p.m., not 12:23 p.m. Irving alleges that while strafing trucks full of refugees, a P-51 flew so low that it crashed into a wagon and exploded. Quoting Taylor again, it is quite true that a Mustang of 20th Group was lost in this way. We even know that the aircraft in question was flown by Lieutenant Jack D. Leon. The problem is that the place where the pilot met his fate was near Donauwörth, in western Bavaria, approximately 210 miles from Dresden. He was killed as he was attacking a vehicle carrying a Wehrmacht colonel, not refugees. Quoting further, no pilot from any of the escort groups died or was lost over Dresden itself. Irving does not refer to any other documentary evidence for the activities by fighter aircraft from groups that were actually at Dresden. The park that Zoomer Historian refers to, I believe, is the Glossogaten. Günther Kannegieser's friend was in there, and Kannegieser said, quote, and he saw no low-flying fighters there, and we both knew what a strafing attack looked like. Policeman Werner Ehrlich was also in the same area, and 40 years after the event said he dodged an incendiary bomb, but, quote, no actual shots. And also, quote, I heard nothing in my official capacity about all those low-flying fighters that are supposed to have done for all those people, allegedly heaps of them. Quoting Taylor, there is no documentary information whatsoever in neither the American Army Air Force documents available, nor, perhaps more significantly in German accounts originating at the time, are such daylight strafing attacks mentioned. David Irving alleges that the A Group of the 20th Fighter Group, which we already mentioned wasn't actually there, had orders to strafe targets of opportunity, including locomotives, trucks, and such. He provides no evidence for this claim. In fact, the official orders given to the fighters who were escorting the bombers at Dresden are available for all to read in the National Archives in Washington. Every attempt will be made to conserve gasoline. Any strafing will be done on withdrawal, at group leader's discretion, if no EA have been encountered, that is enemy air, or are expected. Only A groups will strafe. Airdromes will not be strafed. Now, this seems like it leaves open the possibility for strafing to have occurred, but we know what sort of strafing this group actually carried out. Quote, the group had one squadron in combat over Dresden, no enemy aircraft seen by other groups. A groups went to deck for strafing on withdrawal. This will need some explanation. On withdrawal means after the fighters have finished their escort duties. This means when the fighters have accompanied the bombers back from Dresden towards an area where no enemies are to be expected. The fighters' job was to keep at altitude in proximity to the bombers and to keep up, so as to be able to head off any fighters come to intercept the bombers. A fighter cannot combine this duty with strafing at ground level 20,000 feet below. So the fighter would accompany the bombers until withdrawal, which could happen 30 minutes or 2 hours after the bombs had been dropped, quote, depending on the perceived level of continuing risk. There are actually documented strafing attacks by the aircraft that went to Dresden, but all of those occurred over 100 miles west of Dresden after withdrawal, as instructed in their orders. You might say that the Allies simply covered up their atrocities, but this is unlikely because a potential war crime is literally documented in these reports. A pilot admitted to firing on a hospital train by mistake, because he at first could not make out the red cross on the roofs of their cars. Presumably, he did not make a second pass of the train once he became aware of this. Dr. Helmut Schnatz witnessed the bombing of Koblenz as a boy, and also witnessed low-level strafing. He went on to write authoritative articles on the air war in Germany and became fascinated with the often quite glaring contradiction he found in the accounts of air attacks. After 10 years of research, Dr. Schnatz came to, quote, unmistakable and convincing conclusions, according to Taylor. Schnatz's conclusions are, there were no orders for the fighters to launch low-level strafing of Dresden. Even had this been so, documents regarding the precise course and duration of the operation indicate that no time could have been taken out for strafing over the target. The swift declaration of the all clear by the air raid authorities in Dresden, less than 15 minutes after the last bomb was dropped at 12:31 p.m., indicates that there could have been no additional air attack once the bombers had gone. The P-51s at Dresden were operating close to the limit of their fuel capacity and could not have undertaken extensive low-level strafing so far from base without endangering their own safety. They did strafe, but only far to the west of Dresden, mainly against railway targets, when their escort duties were over and running out of fuel was no longer a problem. Given the agreement between German as well as American accounts of the raid on Dresden, there can be no question of American records being falsified or sanitized after the event. To clarify the latter, he's saying it's impossible that the Americans covered it up, because German records agree with the American records. So for it to have occurred, the Nazis would have had to cover up a war crime against their own people. Strafing did not occur at Dresden. There are numerous reasons why eyewitness accounts allege that it did. Incendiary canisters falling from the sky may take on the appearance of tracers. American and German fighters would likely have chased each other low, as they traded altitude for speed to evade each other's gunfire. Some may have mistaken the mosquitoes who were dropping marking flares for enemy fighter planes, coming in for strafing runs. Most of the people in Dresden had never witnessed a strafing attack up close, and many had just experienced many traumatic hours after the nighttime British bombing raid, followed by a new daylight American bombing raid. It's easy to mistake one thing for another in this sort of situation. As covered, the witness accounts of what happened at Dresden are incredibly contradictory and must therefore be compared to documentary evidence and expert analysis. It's at this point when historians equipped with a more complete overview have the terrible job of overruling the direct testimony of survivors. It's not something historians find pleasant. Though the survivors were never fired at by P-51s, they experienced the moment as such, and the way they experienced the traumatic bombing of Dresden is nonetheless valid, and an important source for understanding wartime trauma. The point of arguing against this myth is not to minimize the experience of survivors, but to correct the historical record. These are two separate things, though sometimes informed by one another.
A month after the massacre, the Dresden police chief reported that over 200,000 dead bodies had been recovered from the ruins, not counting those where nothing was left, as they had been boiled into nothingness. The chief later updated his numbers to 250,000.
Some historian claims he's citing the police chief's numbers. He might think he is, but he isn't. I know this because we know the numbers in the quote final report by the Dresden police and the SS. The report dated March 10th states 18,357 fallen, 2,212 seriously injured, 350,000 homeless and long-term rehoused. The total number of dead, including foreigners, is estimated at approximately 25,000. Beneath the masses of rubble, especially in the inner city, may lie several thousand more fallen, who may for the moment remain totally irrecoverable. Between 1945 and 1966, only 1,858 bodies were recovered from the rubble. That's 20 years. Quote, since 1989, even with the extensive excavation and rebuilding that followed the fall of communism in Dresden, no bodies have been recovered at all, even though careful archaeological investigations have accompanied the redevelopment. Quoting Taylor, the death statistics were not based on rough estimates. The process of registering and counting the dead and their possessions was meticulous in the extreme. The figure that Zoomer historian refers to at 200,000 was initially published not based on any official sources, such as the police chief he mentions, but were published in Svenska Dagbladet, a Swedish magazine. So why does Zoomer historians say these were the numbers of the Dresden police? Taylor says there is a good reason to believe that in March, extracts from the documents by the Dresden police and the SS were leaked to the press. However, the document had been altered. The revised number of dead after the final report, which now numbered at 20,204, was somehow, in this leaked report, revised to 202,040. The police's initial estimation of total dead went from 25,000 to 250,000, and the number of corpses incinerated in the Altmarkt at 6,856 went up to 68,650. Those with keen eyes may notice that every single figure suddenly acquired an extra zero. That's because these documents were leaked to the press by none other than Goebbels' propaganda ministry. Quote, according to testimony at Nuremberg by the chief of the propaganda ministry's press division, Hans Fritzsche, Goebbels had already made his own private estimate of about 40,000 dead at Dresden. The number is actually close to the currently held estimate of between 25,000 and 40,000 dead. Hate to say it, but Goebbels was dead on the money. So how did the numbers actually get to this point, and why does the myth persist so strongly? Once again, Taylor addresses this in one of the appendices of his book. In 1952, Axel Rodenberger published Der Tod von Dresden, in which he compiles hearsay, his own observations, and excerpts from Goebbels' propaganda into something that ends up at a figure of 350,000 to 400,000 dead, based on a quote official report that nobody has ever seen, except supposedly him. Then, predictably once again, David Irving enters the scene. In his 1963 book, Irving produced the number, quote, at least 135,000 dead. This was based on limited evidence at the time and almost pure estimation. Irving didn't have access to the final report, but was given access to the report that had come from Goebbels' propaganda ministry, which then inflated Irving's numbers even higher. Funnily enough, he had said these numbers were fake in the first edition of his book, but changed his mind. In 1965, the final report from the police and the SS finally surfaced. And almost simultaneously, the reports flowing from Dresden to Berlin at the time of the bombing were also discovered. Irving had to later admit that the six-figure numbers he had based himself off, those that had originated in the Nazi Ministry of Propaganda, were, quote, probably a Nazi fake. Alexander McKee, whom Hellstorm also cites and who I've cautioned against relying upon a couple of times in this video, also fiddles with the numbers. At one point, using overestimations of refugees and the lack of enough air raid shelters, he simply decides that the casualty numbers aren't high enough and decides to double them. Quoting Taylor, six-figure numbers of the dead at Dresden would be encouraged by the Nazi propagandists and are still quoted more than half a century later, though mostly by right-wing extremists attempting to gain converts to their cause by promoting the idea of a German Holocaust worse than Auschwitz. However, the accepted death toll both then and now remains between 25,000 and 40,000. Anyways, let's justify the bombing of Dresden.
In what way is American fighters afterwards targeting civilian columns or congregations of them at the parks, destroying the railway junction?
That never happened.
In what way is incinerating between 200,000 and 400,000 people
Never happened.
an acceptable justification for stopping troops which could simply be redirected around the city?
Trains run on tracks. These tracks are in specific places, and the stations they go to have a specific capacity. Some are larger, some are smaller. There's a reason the troops are routed through Dresden to begin with. Quote, with the conquest of vast areas of Eastern Europe and Russia after 1941, Dresden became a part of a huge, overstretched rail network. The importance of Dresden as a transit point for military traffic can be seen from the figures of October 1944. A total of 28 military trains, altogether carrying almost 20,000 officers and men, were in transit through Dresden-Neustadt each day. Taylor argues that 3 months later, conditions were right for this number to have been higher, though I don't believe concrete numbers for this exist. Quoting Taylor, that was part of the Allies' calculation when they started to place Dresden in their sights. He quotes an American prisoner of war who was there. The night before the raids on February 13th, we were shunted into the Dresden marshalling yard, where for nearly 12 hours German troops and equipment rolled into and out of Dresden. I saw with my own eyes that Dresden was an armed camp. Thousands of German troops, tanks and artillery, and miles of freight cars loaded with supplies supporting and transporting German logistics towards the east to meet the Russians.
In what way is deliberately creating a firestorm going to stop a railway any better than other means at the disposal of the Allies that would cause far fewer or no civilian casualties?
I don't personally believe the firestorm was in any way justifiable, but the rationale for utilizing incendiary bombs should be explained. Strategic bombing is not very accurate, and strategic bombing at night even less so. Utilizing incendiary bombs means you can be sure to devastate a much larger area, and it can complicate works to put out fires or mitigate destruction. The goal of strategic bombing is to maximize destruction of your targets. In this case, not just the rail yard, but also the outlying industry and infrastructure. The chaos serves a purpose, even if it is horrific. Quoting Taylor again, Dresden remained known to the outside world almost exclusively for its leisure-related and luxury industries. This was an important factor in the pervasive post-war myth that, at the time of the bombing raids, it was a, quote, city without industry, and, quote, of no military or industrial importance. Even many prosperous Dresdeners seemed to have been only half aware of what went on in their city, away from the pleasant suburbs where they lived. Most of the factories formerly making consumer goods or luxury items had by 1944 been turned over almost entirely to war work. Sewing machine factories were converted into armaments factories. The company Richard Gable & Co. went from producing machines for making marzipan and waffles to 96% of its production going to the military, including torpedo parts for the Navy. A concentration camp laborer transported to Dresden for slave labor in the Dresden factories described filling bullets in a factory originally intended for cigarette production. These are just some of the examples of the many ways factories were converted for armaments production in Dresden. Both Dresden's industry became more important and its position as a transport junction became more important as the war went on. This made Dresden an obvious target for Allied bombing. In fact, 1 month prior to the bombing raids, Heinz Guderian, the chief of the Army General Staff, had secretly classified Dresden as a military strongpoint. General Adolf Strauss had been put in charge of setting up a defensive line running straight through Dresden to force the Red Army to spend the lives of their soldiers in costly house-to-house fighting throughout the so-called City of Art. The city was, quote, intended in late Hitlerite Gotterdammerung fashion to be defended to the bitter end. Though the incendiary bombs were of course dropped by the Allies, part of the responsibility of the death toll in Dresden must also be placed on the authorities, as Dresden was woefully under-equipped with bombing shelters. The Nazis designated Dresden as a strongpoint without giving it air defenses or bombing shelters to protect its civilian population against what would inevitably be the result of such an action. Now, in terms of what effect the bombs actually had on its intended targets, the bombing had greater perceived effect than Allied planners had anticipated, as evidenced by the fact that the second wave of night bombers had to improvisationally select a new target for their bombs, because the first wave had unexpectedly been enough to devastate the target of the raid. Of course, the firestorm was still raging, and daytime aerial photography hadn't yet taken stock of the damage, so they had no way of knowing what real effect the raid would have had at this point. Among expressly military targets that were destroyed, only one was important. The Wehrmacht's main command post in Dresden was totally annihilated, taking with it every enlisted man and officer inside. Many military hospitals were also destroyed. Very few soldiers were killed as they were confined to barracks, and the barracks by the river Elbe had emerged unscathed. Almost 200 factories were damaged. 136 of these were seriously damaged. 41 of these were mentioned as important for military production. 21 of these experienced 100% production stoppages as a result of the bombing. Quote, "The effect on armaments production must have been enormous. Disruption did not arise from damage to the factory buildings alone. Death of workers, damage to their homes and to essential infrastructure, including transportation links, also played a vital part in drastic reductions in productivity."
It feels wrong to promote my Patreon, or anything else, as I normally would, at the end of the video.
It doesn't feel wrong to promote my Patreon at the end of this video where I correct the record on falsehoods spread by a Nazi YouTuber. So if you like this video, want behind the scenes content, early access to videos and such, or just want to support what I'm trying to do, please check out the Patreon linked below. In conclusion, in addition to Zoomer Historian being an out-and-about Nazi, he is profoundly lazy. His plagiarism of neo-Nazi authors is a part of his weaponized laziness. If you cite a really bad source, it's very easy to look at that source and know your argument probably sucks. If you're lazy and cite no source, it's a lot harder. Zoomer Historian is a terrible historian who lazily and uncritically regurgitates any source so long as it's signed by a fellow Nazi. Zoomer Historian is also a coward who hides behind a thin veneer of false objectivity. I like to think I'm not a coward, so I'll offer my take on the bombing of Dresden. The tremendous civilian casualties and complete destruction of Dresden represents one of countless tragedies in the course of the war. The bombing of Dresden followed a pattern of escalating attacks against civilian population centers started by Nazi Germany, and was in line with how war was conducted at the time. However, there is debate whether or not it represents a war crime. That is not for me to say. However, the way in which the bombing was carried out should be critiqued. An ad hoc decision to change the bombing location at night to ensure maximum destruction seems to me, in hindsight, irresponsible. And we know now that strategic bombing was not nearly as effective as the Allies had hoped it would be, which begs the question, was it worth it? I won't condemn the bombing of Dresden, but I will criticize how the Allies went about it. Dresden by no means had to earn the dubious moniker, the largest area destroyed by aerial bombing in a single day. Quoting Major General Frederick Louis Anderson, commander of the 8th Bomber Command in the European Theatre of Operations of World War II. The air gives uncurbed bestial instincts a wider field of expression, leaving only humanity and common sense to dictate limitations. All of us have seen the result of air power as used by the beast. To one such as he, any horror is justified so long as his end is accomplished. But he fails to realize that even his purpose could be better accomplished if he used methods which are more efficient and which happen at the same time to be more humane. In the period. Zoomer Historian ended his video with a quote by Arthur Harris, and I will too. But first, I want to briefly tell you about the first building of Dresden to be set ablaze in the period. Quote, "On November 9th, 1938, a group of SA men broke into the synagogue even before the main mob arrived, scattering gasoline and setting alight the interior, with its rich hangings and wooden furniture and fittings. The firefighters rushed toward the still fresh conflagration, only to find themselves barred from quelling the fire by a ring of SS and SA thugs. By morning, what had once been the largest synagogue in Germany was a collection of smoking ruins." Finally, I want to quote Arthur Harris's famous whirlwind speech. Quote, "The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everyone else, and nobody was going to bomb them." Zoomer Historian represents a growing problem on History YouTube and on social media in general, of far-right actors allowed to spew their alternative narratives unchallenged and unmoderated, often aimed specifically at children and those who don't know better. If you'd like to support my work challenging this sort of stuff on YouTube, please subscribe to my Patreon. And special thank you to the patrons at the $10 tier. Pencil, Lolo M, Alice D, Vishire, Jordan M, and Monday's Last Brain Cell. Thank you all so much, and thank you for watching. But not at the IP when I thought we were. I think we are now. Or we're past it.
Cleveland, hold formation. Release on my command. Out.
Oh, when are we releasing, man?